For me, I think it's being clear, like being awake, being right, like having intention in what you're doing. I think so often when we're in a pattern, whether drinking or not, we can end up living life kind of going through the motions. We end up doing certain things, having a job that maybe we've been in forever, having the same friends, maybe doing the same things over and over again, and never pausing and saying, is this the life I want? Am I fulfilled? Is there something else out there for me?
Welcome to the Sober Edge podcast, inspiration for alcohol-free living. I'm your host, Terry Patterson, functional nutritionist and This Naked Mind senior coach. The Sober Edge is a place to explore the infinite possibilities on the other side of drinking. In a culture soaked in booze, discover the wonder and joy of taking a different path. Meet real people living lives of purpose and passion, learn the truth behind the alcohol myths, and get ready to be motivated, inspired, and astounded by what is possible with the Sober Edge. Well, hey, it's Terry, and I'm excited to reintroduce you to one of my favorite guests ever on the Sober Edge podcast. Amanda E. White and I had a conversation that was aired initially in November of 2021. And I am sharing this Encore episode with you because this has been my most popular episode ever. Yes. So Amanda is the author of Not Drinking Tonight. And since we first talked in November of 2021, she has published her book, Not Drinking Tonight, in January of 2022. She followed that with her companion guide, the workbook, Not Drinking Tonight, which is especially for clinicians. So not only is she sharing her own journey, sharing what she knows, how to help those of you who are over drinking, she's actually reaching out to your therapist, your doctors, the professional and wellness professionals in your life to help them have these conversations in the most powerful and impactful way. She also is continuing her blog. She's since had a baby. She is sharing all of the time about eating disorders or disordered eating and boundaries. So if you haven't met Amanda E. White before, I'm delighted to reintroduce you here with this Encore episode from Not Drinking Tonight. I hope you enjoy. All right. Well, it's Terry back with you with another edition of the Sober Edge podcast. And I'm so excited to introduce my superstar, rock star guest today, Amanda White. Amanda, hello. And would you please introduce yourself to our guests?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. So I'm Amanda. You might know me on Instagram as Therapy for Women. I'm a licensed therapist. I'm in recovery myself from alcohol. I'm sober. And I also have a book coming out that's called Not Drinking Tonight. So I'm excited to be here.
I'm so excited to dive into the book and talk about what led you to having this conversation. My daughter was the one that introduced me to you. So I love that you're working with this age group. She's like in her late 30s. And she's like, Mom, I think you could really connect with this gal. You were like doing sort of the same things, which is just trying to normalize the conversation around what is it when we are using alcohol in a way that's not serving us. And I think that's so important. And one of the things that really struck me in your kind of language that you use around the work you do is you talk about living this intentional life. So what does that mean?
Yeah, for me, I think it's being clear, like being awake, being right, like having intention in what you're doing. I think so often when we're in a pattern, whether drinking or not, we can end up living life kind of going through the motions. We end up doing certain things, having a job that maybe we've been in forever, having the same friends, maybe doing the same things over and over again, and never pausing and saying, is this the life I want? Am I fulfilled? Is there something else out there for me? So especially with alcohol, it just really, I think, numbs us and sometimes prevents us from really making those intentional choices because we just assume this is just the way life is always going to be.
Yes. And I hear that a lot in my coaching practice and clients that I work with. And I love to talk about this idea of expectations versus intentions, because we can get so caught up in, I have to do it this way, or this is the only way it's going to work, or I messed up. And, always bringing it back to what is the openness around intention? What is your intention rather than a goal? And so, yeah, I think that's so powerful.
Yeah, I love that too, because I often say in a similar vein that it's better to set, like boundaries with yourself or boundaries with other people rather than rules. Like, I think that's especially helpful if you're trying to change a behavior, similar to what you're saying about intentions versus goals, because a rule or a goal can sometimes feel like we did it or we didn't. It creates this binary. And often when we don't meet a goal or something happens that we didn't expect, we can get mad at ourselves, we can beat ourselves up, and then we can ironically end up doing, right, to comfort ourselves, almost the exact same thing that we were trying to change. And it creates this cycle where if we can understand that change is hard, life is messy, we're going to have slip ups, we're going to mess up, things aren't going to go according to plan, we can have more flexibility with taking different action versus coming from the place of taking action because we failed.
Oh, yeah, exactly. In the work of Annie Grace and This Naked Mind, where I trained as a coach, we call them data points. So if someone has a drink when they didn't want to or didn't intend to, we call it a data point because it's so important to factor in the learning behind it. And there's no losing with learning. And so it's such a powerful way to help people, like you said, get out of that binary mindset. Really powerful.
Yes. And I love that, Annie and her work, you guys talk about it as an experiment, because I think the word experiment is so powerful too when we're trying to change everything. Because to your point, if you're doing, even if you I talk a lot on my Instagram about living life like an experiment, treating self-care like an experiment, because that is, that is what it is. We change and grow, and you may find that one thing is working for you and then your life changes, and then you need to modify it. And I think it really helps us realize that there isn't an end point. There isn't an arrival. There's always going to be something to kind of work on and discover.
I love that. Yes, discover, right? So I want to ask you a little bit about your journey to becoming alcohol free. And I know you mentioned before we started recording that that was kind of during grad school, you noticed that maybe drinking is getting in the way. And I'm really curious about, like, most people I find get to a place where they've maybe been questioning their drinking, or there's some signs, but they don't really want to peek under the blanket, so to speak. And then, there sort of becomes a point where it's like, okay. So I'm wondering what happened for you. Not that we have a rock bottom, because I really think that's one of those myths that we can simply choose to make a change because we're curious about how our life can be more intentional. So I wonder what that was like for you.
Yeah. And I completely agree with you. And I think it's really clear, quote unquote, rock bottom. It wasn't the first day that I'd ever thought about not drinking. It was just a day that I happened to really listen to that voice that was telling me that there might be another way. So as I was talking to you about, so I was in grad school to become a therapist. I was working at a drug and alcohol rehab. I had worked through an eating disorder and was in recovery from that. I always knew my eating disorder was a problem. I never thought I had a problem. People in my life drank. I was in college for a lot of my drinking career. I was 24 when I stopped drinking. So I thought I was doing what 24-year-olds do. And essentially what happened with me is I realized that my drinking was escalating. It switched kind of from just going out to I started drinking wine at night. I started relying on it more to deal with difficulties or emotions or things like that. I also was really, really using it as a way to kind of prove that I was fun and I was cool. I was literally a yoga teacher at the time. I would make jokes in my yoga class about like drinking, or tell people like, we'll go out for a drink afterwards, because I thought it was so cool to be like wellnessy, but cool. And drinking was a way I proved that I was cool. And my whole life, really, I never felt cool. I moved a lot growing up. So I struggled with friends a lot. And that was really what connected me to alcohol, is I felt like it was social currency in that way. And yeah, eventually I started, I mean, I had doubts for sure that maybe my drinking wasn't great, as I would show up to work at a drug and alcohol facility hungover. But, I justified it how I could. And then I taught yoga drunk one morning and completely didn't remember it. Internal voice kind of said, like, you can't keep doing this. Like, you're not going to live the life you want. You're not going to become a therapist and be successful if you keep doing this. I just decided to listen, and I tried to stop drinking for 30 days. And I was lucky that I, was already in therapy with a great therapist who supported me, and I was able to make friends and find connections. And the hilarious thing is, when I told my parents I was going to stop drinking, they were not really supportive. They were like, we think you're overreacting. We think that this is being dramatic. You're going to not be able to make friends. You're not going to be happy. How are you going to ever find, a romantic relationship? But it was like the best thing that ever happened to me. I mean, a lot of my best friends don't drink, and the relationships I have now are just so amazing. I met my husband through a mutual friend who doesn't drink. So my whole life really is like this beautiful product of not drinking.
Oh, I love that so much. And it's interesting. You and I have a similar story around parents, because when I told my mom I was going to stop drinking, she's like, but you don't have a problem. Why would you stop drinking? And, she kind of questioned me for the first few months. And finally, I told her, I said, okay, Mom, if I was a smoker and I told you I was going to stop smoking, what would you say? She'd like, oh, I'd be like so happy for you. I'd be cheering you on. I'd be excited that you're making this healthy change. And I said, okay, well, do that for me with alcohol, because I need that level of support. So yeah, it's so interesting. We talk in the This Naked Mind methodology about our culture's view of problem drinkers and normal drinkers. And we don't address this gray area drinking. That's where people can really get stuck. But you mentioned something else that I think is so powerful about community, and having this community around where you were able to make friends and build this community where people were not drinking. And I think that's so key. And, my wish for everyone is that they have more of that, and that it becomes more normal, so that it's more available, that people get together and they actually talk about, this is a, alcohol-free group, or we're doing intentionally not having alcohol after the sporting event or after the yoga class, right? Yeah. Because it is going against the mainstream culture in many ways.
Yes, absolutely. Especially, I feel like, on one hand, it is really exciting that more people are talking about this, that I see more, alcohol-free options on menus. But at the same time, there's also, according to the research, more and more people drinking more and more. And then you see stuff at, breweries and, like juice bars that serve, cocktails with juice, alcohol. So I think it is this weird dynamic of both things happening at the same time.
Yes, I agree. And you mentioned also some things that, you were sort of worried about would happen, or even that your parents were worried, I'm not going to have friends. I'm not going to find a romantic partner. I'm not going to have fun, So I wonder, what was your biggest fear around letting go of drinking? What did you kind of wonder, is this going to change?
I was convinced that I wouldn't be fun. I wouldn't be cool. I wouldn't have any friends. I thought I couldn't go to concerts or go to a wedding. The first thing, which I think is really common if you're young and you're not married when you stop drinking, is, well, what about my wedding day? Am I not going to have champagne on my wedding? Somehow that's the first thing that we always think, which is really funny to me, because I got married 2 years ago. And it was like the most amazing experience. And it was my wedding. So I had fun mocktails. So no one thought it was weird that I wasn't drinking at my own wedding. But yeah, I think that cultural expectation of just fun equals alcohol is something that I'm really hoping changes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I love the work that you do on Instagram, just kind of normalizing the conversation and making it not a scary subject, right? Like, we can question our drinking from a place of either wellness or curiosity. And so how has that kind of like, you mentioned you working in an alcohol and drug rehab place during grad school. So was your focus always going to be on helping people with substance abuse, or?
That was what I was doing in school. Cause I was like, it's not eating disorders, because I knew I couldn't work with eating disorders right away because my recovery was still very young with that. But I was like, I feel like these are similar. So that was what I went to school for. And when I graduated from my master's degree, I did go on to work full time at a drug and alcohol rehab. So that is where a lot of my clinical work and experience is. But when I started my private practice, I did start working with just like other women. And, not everyone that came to see me was questioning their relationship with alcohol. And when I started posting on Instagram, obviously, my handle is Therapy for Women. So it's not, not drinking tonight or something like that. But it's a huge part of who I am and what I believe in. And I think it is so adjacent to mental health and important to have those conversations. And I think it's really, really cool that, some of my clients or people that see me or even reach out to me on Instagram, they give the feedback kind of I don't have a problem with drinking. But it's just, I'm realizing like, maybe there are other options. Maybe there's something else. And I really come from the viewpoint of, is alcohol making your life better? And if it's not, what do you want? What can we create? What can we think about differently? So it's really important for me on Instagram specifically that I wasn't a sober only space, because I felt like number one, I feel like self-care, all of these things can apply to so many people. But number two, I really believe that like, anyone should be able to question their relationship with alcohol, and I'm not trying to convert anyone. And I just kind of want to destigmatize and normalize this conversation and have my Instagram be a place where drinkers and non-drinkers can like coexist essentially. And that, sometimes I get pushback for it, but I'm very clear that's my intention.
I love that, because there are sober Instagram accounts out there and it's wonderful. It's great, but it's also part of what we were talking about as far as whether health professionals or wellness professionals being able to make this a safe conversation means that we meet people where they're at. And I was on a conversation earlier today and the woman asked me, well, how do you coach people that don't want to quit drinking forever? And it's like, you coach them where they're at. I mean, that is the coaching relationship, right? You hold space for them to discover what it is they really want and how to create a place that they are excited about life and moving forward in their intentional life. And so it doesn't look like, the black and white is in the past. It's a rainbow. It's a total rainbow of colors. And so that's so powerful. You mentioned mental health and the connection with drinking. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So just in terms of, right, like alcohol as a substance, I think we forget that it is not something that we're designed to drink. Our body doesn't love it, right? As like Holly Whitaker has said, it is essentially like the same thing as rocket fuel. So I think like it's really important to just understand on a biological level. And I talk about this a lot in my book about evolution and the history of drinking and all of that stuff. But in terms of mental health, I mean, one of the biggest things that people don't realize is alcohol makes your anxiety way, way worse. And so many of us, I think, especially this year, are struggling with anxiety and depression. And it's tricky because initially when you drink, you do feel numb. So your anxiety does feel like it goes away. But alcohol is a depressant. So your body produces anxiety producing hormones like cortisol to come back to homeostasis. This happens even after alcohol leaves your body, even if you've only had one drink. And that's where the phenomenon of feeling more anxious after you drink really comes in. So I think that is one of the biggest ones that people only seem to talk about alcohol use in terms of addiction. And they don't understand that having one drink also impacts your mental health.
I'm so glad you spoke to that, because that is really, yes, people will often say, well, I don't know if I want to stop drinking forever. I want to be able to have, maybe one drink a week. And it's like, okay, well, let's talk about, why, what is alcohol bringing to the table, and are the trade-offs worth it? And do you understand the trade-offs? So powerful that you talk about that in terms of, it's not just people who are binge drinking or drinking in excess, as they would call maybe over drinking. It's really the impact of alcohol based on the fact that it is the component is ethanol. And so good to just talk about it as it really is instead of glossing over. I think about this idea of, we treat alcohol like it's this innocuous substance. Like there's no cautionary tales when somebody turns 21. In fact, when my kids turned 21, the accepted cultural norm was I take them out for their first drink as a parent. Let's go to the bar. And I think how about we should have equal conversation about, what does alcohol really do to your mental health? And I remember when I first heard that term, hangxiety, I had never heard that before. And I remember a friend told me, well, when I drink, I don't get hungover, but I get heightened anxiety the next day. So I'm assuming that you find people that show up in your practice with that, clients that ask questions about that. And I don't think anxiety is necessarily a medical term, but this is part of what you're talking about, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that there isn't even probably as much research on kind of like what 1 drink, 2 drinks, 3 drinks really does to us and our mental health, because I think doctors, therapists, like medical professionals are so focused often on addiction and substance misuse. And they spend a lot of time trying to quantify what is normal and what is not normal, that I think that just like anxiety, and people have just started talking about that more. And I know like Annie Grace did some amazing work, just like, because that conversation didn't exist when her book came out, but actually talking about what even just 1 drink does to you. So yeah, I think a lot of people don't necessarily know the term hangxiety. They might think that it's just part of being hungover, or they don't totally make the connection, because anxiety can also be not in your face. It could be just like accelerated heart rate, unable, like tightness in your chest, irritability, overwhelm, all of these little subtle things that I think sometimes people also just think this is my baseline state. And they have no idea that maybe there is a connection with drinking and that, or worrying about what you said and that. Like, I know when I stopped drinking, I was like, there are people who don't, wake up the next day and like comb through their phone and wonder what they said and worry about what they did, and what a relief like that was. Because to your point, we normalize it. When I was in college, we used to laugh about, all the things that we did the next day. And we never paused and said like, this is kind of odd, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm so glad you shared that. Yeah, thank you for that personal touch on that. It's so, so important. And I think one of the things that floored me, I was doing a presentation, so I was doing a little research, and I think it's the Center for Disease Control, normal drinking for women, 1 drink a night, so 7 drinks, but excessive drinking is 8. And I was like, wait a minute, shouldn't it be like normal drinking is 2 and excessive drinking is 8? Like, what happened there? They went right from, this is normal, this is fine, 1 more drink, you're way over the line. And I thought, okay, this system needs a little tweaking, because that doesn't make sense. And I think it just speaks to how we don't really have conversation about what 1 drink does, what 2 drinks does, and yes, Annie has absolutely done some work around that. And one of the things when you were talking, we have that dynorphin is one of those chemicals along with cortisol that, and the thing about dynorphin is it stays in our system for longer. There's no like mechanism that helps us deplete the dynorphin on a timeline. So you can stay with that heightened anxiety for a long time. And so I love that you are addressing, anxiety can be a huge part of the connection with drinking, that we want to talk about that. And we want people to understand that piece, because we can do better, as wellness professionals, health professionals, we can really help people understand that connection. So That's so good. So I want to talk about your book. I'm super excited about that. So I read some of the reviews that, people that have pre-read the book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet because it's not coming out till January 4th. But I'm wondering what led you to write this book?
I've seen the conversation shifting. I am a huge fan of Quit Lit myself. I've read every memoir, every book that exists on the topic. And what I really felt was missing was just a therapist's perspective on this, because every clinician that has written about alcohol writes about it in terms of substance use, substance abuse, alcoholism, addiction. It's either addiction and Quit Lit. And there's nothing in between. I think Annie Grace and Holly Whitaker's book are the most in between in terms of not just memoirs, but I really felt like that was what was needed. And I really felt like I could be the one to share that, just because I am sober myself. I was in AA, I'm not anymore. So I really can talk about the nuance and kind of the pros and the cons. And from the clinician's perspective, I really feel like there isn't a lot of when people come to me and say that they want to question their relationship with alcohol, there aren't a ton of books out there that in a clinical way help people break down their relationships. So the book has lots of exercises and questions and graphics to also kind of help you learn for yourself. And I kind of say that my book is, I say in the introduction that this book is kind of like an informed consent on alcohol. In the therapy world, before you engage in therapy with someone, you need to give them an understanding. You have to give them informed consent to do therapy. And no one gives us this about alcohol. No one tells us the risks, the benefits, how we can cope without it, how it may be impacting us. So that's really my goal, is to give readers informed consent. And I don't try to sway them one way or the other, but I tell them the research and the research on moderation and the research on how it impacts us. And I don't believe in labels, and they get to, explore that.
That's beautiful to think about informed consent. And so, yes, just sort of presenting the case for understanding more about the risks or the impacts, as opposed to, like you said, trying to sway someone one way or the other. That's so powerful because that's so needed. So I'm wondering, did this feel like a brave move for you? I don't know that there's a lot of other therapists that are really going there.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting because I do get pushback on Instagram about being sober. Sometimes people tell me that I share too much or whatever. I do feel like the culture is shifting where it is more normal, and more research is coming out about it. So that's definitely supported me in this whole process. But yeah, it does feel very vulnerable in terms of going against some of the grain about addiction. And I think that there's still, unfortunately, a narrative that if you give someone permission to question their relationship with alcohol, you're giving people permission, like the idea that harm reduction is harmful because then it's going to hurt people who do have a problem. And I think that's the most vulnerable piece for me. That's where I'm kind of going against the grain the most, but I'm so clear that it's so important because, I talk about in my book, if you look at the percentages of people, so many people are being left out of the conversation because they don't meet the criteria for severe alcohol use disorder. Very low percentage of people meet that criteria. And what if we can reach people earlier, or just people who never would have maybe questioned it? And why can't we just someone can come see me and question their relationship with anything else in their life, and I don't label them. I think the same should be true of alcohol.
Yes, exactly. What you said about the harm reduction, I've seen that kind of pushback. People say, well, I've read articles that say, this sober curious movement is dangerous. And it's
yeah,
well, wait a minute.
They always use the word dangerous too.
Yeah. And it's wait, are you saying it's taboo to talk about drinking in any other way? That because this whole, I think it was Jolene Park, maybe, I don't know if she was the first person, but, she had a TED talk that she labeled gray area drinking. And that is, become a term that I think is so important in this conversation because it's like we talked about earlier, it's not black and white. There are these subtleties to people's drinking. And again, you don't have to have a problem to question your relationship with alcohol. And it's just so important to continue. I'm so glad you're doing this, because it's so important to open up all possibilities when it comes to this communication around this subject, because when we close off one area and say, well, we can talk about it this way, but we can't talk about it over here.
Yeah.
That just, I think, creates, first of all, the stigma that people that are gray area drinking feel totally alone. It's amazing how many people come into the programs where I coach or one-on-one work and say, I never knew anybody else had this same, they questioned their drinking as well.
Yeah.
And I've been sober. So for me, I just celebrated 6 years, and I didn't have the work of somebody like Annie Grace or This Naked Mind or Holly Whitaker. That work came a little later. And so I didn't have the role model, but I think that we need to have more people stand up and say, there's many, many ways to address this issue. And it is an issue. And so I just think it's wonderful that you are being brave, and it is vulnerable, like you said, and bravo for you. That's where we grow, right? When we move out of that place of comfort and we say, okay, I'm going to risk something that is important. So well done.
Thank you. Yeah. To your point, when I got sober too, one of the first things I did was Google sober celebrities. And I think it's like a joke. A lot of people do that because I needed to think of someone who I respected or thought was cool or, beautiful or something, who was sober. So, social media didn't exist the way it does now when I was getting sober too. And I think it's just so important to be like, I can be myself and I can be sober. And if one person can feel less alone, I'm doing my job.
I mentioned that my reason for having this podcast is that I want to inspire people. Like, I think our whole world can open up on the other side of alcohol. And instead of playing small and feeling like, oh, I'm afraid to move in this direction, we can, people like you can help us understand that there are so many things waiting and available to us when we just question this one part of our life and ask, would I be better served if I wasn't drinking? So it's such good work. I wanted to ask you talk about in your website about boundaries and self-love. And I wonder where that comes in the book. Do you talk about how boundaries and self-love, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the book is kind of broken up into 3 parts. The first part is like why you drink. It's history of alcohol. It's exploring your relationship with alcohol. It talks about shame and trauma and how that may impact. And then the second part of the book is all about filling in for the gaps where maybe we didn't feel that we needed to, and especially those that drank. So then we didn't have to set boundaries to deal with not having to take care of ourselves or not having to have tough conversations. So I have like a whole chapter on boundaries and the importance of learning how to set them so that you don't have to rely on alcohol to deal with not setting them, right? And also, if you stay sober, you're going to have boundary conversations often. I talk about real self-care and what that looks like and how it can change depending on what's going on in your life, and how when you stop drinking, you're going to need to take better care of yourself because, again, you're not asleep anymore. You're awake to some of these things. You're awake to life. And so it was really important to me in my book to give people real practical research-backed tools so that, we know a lot of times when you stop drinking, things feel worse before they feel better. It can be scary having your emotions come back. So a big part of my book is arming people with tools so that they can ride that wave and get to the other side and really then be empowered in their choice to drink or not. But even if they choose to drink, then they have tools maybe to drink less or be less, reliant on alcohol to fill those gaps.
Yes, we need that so much. We need more practical tools in this conversation. With This Naked Mind, the work that I do, we see that they move toward feeling better. And then maybe they get to a place where, like you said, all of these emotions are coming up and they're big emotions. And what do I do with them? And I know you talked about using alcohol so we don't have to set boundaries. My husband and I just recently celebrated our 39th wedding anniversary. And when I stopped drinking first and he followed 2 years later, which was amazing. But I had to face the fact that I had been using alcohol rather than setting boundaries, or rather than having hard conversations, or rather than standing up for it and asking for what I needed. And when I stopped drinking and I looked at my marriage, I thought, oh, this is broken. There's like a lot of pieces that are not working here. And so I think it's so powerful that you are going to have that as part of the book, because we need to know that there's been some things that maybe we've been using alcohol for, but we can come back from that. We can make these positive changes.
Yes, I have a whole chapter on my book about how to date sober, how to have sex sober, how to work, what do you do if your partner still drinks? How do you tell family? All of that, requires boundaries and tough conversations and vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's true. It's true. So I'm curious about how you think it's going with spreading the word, this message. Like, you are big on Instagram, and there's other people out there that are having this conversation. Do you feel like we're moving in the right direction? Give us some hope from the wise words of Amanda.
I do think we're moving in the right direction. I get less pushback. I used to, a couple of years ago, get a lot of pushback when I would share, and people do seem to, I think it might be also the pandemic of, I think people really realized that they were drinking more and drinking a lot. I think the studies coming out about alcohol, one drink, even when alcohol not being recommended by doctors anymore, is great. So I do feel hope. I do think the conversation is moving forward. I think there's a lot more work to go, but according to studies, millennials and Gen Z specifically are the more sober, curious wellness generation too. So I think that's really exciting.
That's so hopeful. Thank you for that, because we do want to shift the conversation. And sometimes it can feel like it's an uphill battle when we suddenly see, like you and I talked about, suddenly, there's specialized fancy juice drinks with alcohol in them. And it's like, well, wait a minute, juicing used to be a healthy thing. Now we've added alcohol to it. Where did we go wrong, right? Are we moving in the right direction? So I think it is so hopeful to remind ourselves that, yes, there's much more work to be done, but we are, just like the work that you're doing is really helping to move the conversation forward and to help us feel empowered. I think that that's such an important part of this. I think the alcohol culture and, the marketers really want us to accept this without questioning. And we've got the mommy wine culture, and there's just so many places that we're bombarded with, you shouldn't question it. And so I think having the opportunity to have a voice out there that says, oh, yes, you should question this. We have to balance the scale, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
Where can people connect with you, and when is your book going to be out?
So my book will be out January 4th. So you can check it out and order from anywhere books are sold, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all that good stuff. And I'm also on Instagram at Therapy for Women.
And you have a whole section. I mean, you have a whole practice that is Therapy for Women. If women are looking to connect with you around getting therapy, or, just having this conversation with a therapist, how can they find you?
Yeah. So I have a list that's based in the Philadelphia area, but we have licensed therapists across the country. We have 12 states now. So that's at therapyforwomencenter.com.
Am I understanding that this center that you created this, and now you have other therapists that work doing the work that you kind of set up? That's amazing.
Yeah. So thank you. Yeah. I created the practice 4.5 years ago, and we now have 25 therapists. So yeah.
Wow. I love that, because it just shows that. And do you think that I'm wondering if you were still drinking, do you think that that would have been the trajectory of your business?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I don't even know if I would. Yeah. I mean, the courage that I feel like, or how difficult it was for me to start my own practice, to take that risk, all of that really came from when you've done something hard, like quitting drinking. It's one of the most empowering, confidence boosting things you can do, because you trust yourself to do hard things.
It's so good, because I do think that when we're drinking, we stop trusting ourselves, because our no doesn't mean no, and our yes doesn't mean yes. And we get caught up in this idea that we're failing at, trying to make this change. And we can really fall into a place where I think we kind of turn our intuition off. And so we don't trust
Yeah.
ourselves to take risks. So it's so great that you mentioned that you felt empowered to take this risk. And what a beautiful ending, well, not ending, but what a beautiful midpoint to your story, that you have created something that is you're passionate about, is a lived experience that you have had. And oh my gosh, having all of these other therapists out there. Do the other therapists talk to women about their journey with alcohol as well?
Yeah, so we do have some therapists that specialize in alcohol and substance use, and we have other therapists who specialize in just anxiety, depression, eating disorders, parenthood, fertility issues. We really specialize in women's issues.
I want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing your time and inspiring all of us of what it's like to make a change and how important it is to speak up about what is happening in the world with the alcohol culture and also to tell our own story. So thank you for sharing your story, Amanda.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
I want to thank you for tuning in to the Sober Edge podcast. This is a place for important conversations and a safe place to question everything you thought you knew about drinking. If you're looking for your sober edge, I want to invite you to connect with me at thesobernutritionist.com, where you can grab my free resource, Becoming More, a guide to loving your sober life. And I would be so grateful if you enjoyed this podcast, if you would leave a rating and review, as it will help more people find their sober edge.